In this video, I'm going to be looking at biopsychology for the AQA A-level 7182, and this is the topic that I'm going to be looking at. It's about localization of function in the brain. It's about the motor and somatosensory cortices, and it's about the visual, auditory and language centres of the brain, including Broca's and Wernicke's areas. It covers most of this topic in the AQA A-level, but not the whole thing, because this is a really long topic and there's lots in there, and I'm going to be coming back and filling in the gaps in this topic in another video. Okay, localization of function. What is it? Well, it's the idea that different parts of the brain specialise in different jobs. And if you look at the human brain in real life, then there are no dividing lines on it. If you look at the textbook, then obviously there's like a line around a particular area, and it'll say, well, this part of the brain specialises in vision, and that part of the brain specialises in smell, and so on. Well, that doesn't obviously exist in real life, and when you look at a living human brain, frankly, one part of the cortex appears to be really similar, if not identical, to another part of the cortex, and there are no real dividing lines in the brain. It's a bit like looking at the Earth from space. When you look down on the Earth, you can't see the lines where the countries are, but the lines are there, and on one side of the line they might speak one language, and on another side of the line they might speak a different language. Well, the brain's like that. You can't see the dividing lines, but they are there in real life, and different parts of the brain are specialised for different functions. Localisation of function. The idea that function, the stuff that the brain does, is localised to specialist areas. Right, before we get stuck into the topic, we need to learn our way around the brain, and we just need to know a little bit of specialist vocabulary to help us there, because the more specialist biological vocabulary that you put into your essay, the more impressive it's going to be to the examiner. So, up, down, left, right, and so on. In the brain, we don't say top and bottom. We say dorsal and ventral. Dorsal is the top part of the brain, and ventral is underneath. And that's really easy to remember, okay, because it's the same as in a fish. A fish has got a dorsal fin, that's the bit that sticks out of the water if you're a shark in a horror film, and ventral is underneath. Left and right, well, that's left and right as normal, obviously. Left, right, or opposite if you're looking at it from talking to a person opposite them. Posterior and anterior. The front part of the brain, here, the front is the anterior part, and the rear part of the brain at the back is called the posterior part. A sulcus is a groove or a furrow in the brain, and there's a very important sulcus that we're going to be looking at in this video, which is the central sulcus, which basically runs thus, from the top of the brain right down the sides. Okay, and the final piece of vocabulary that we really need to know about for the purposes of this video is contralateral and ipsilateral. Contralateral and ipsilateral connections describe how the brain is connected to the body, and the vast majority of the human brain is connected contralaterally. And what that means is that the left-hand side of the brain controls the right-hand side of the body. So if you get a stroke or a brain injury in your left hemisphere, then you're going to end up paralysed in the right-hand side of your body. And correspondingly, the right hemisphere controls the left-hand side of the body. That's contralateral connections crossing over, okay? And the vast majority of connections in a mammal's brain are contralateral. There are some exceptions, and those are ipsilateral connections, and that's where the left-hand side of the brain is connected to the left-hand side of the body and the right to the right. There's a very small number of ipsilateral connections in our brains, but they are important, and we're going to be learning about some of them in this video. Okay, the motor and the somatosensory cortices. The motor cortex is the part of the brain which controls our voluntary movement. And it's the beginning of a nervous pathway that runs from the brain to all of the muscles in the body that are controlled by voluntary movement. What happens is when a cell in the motor cortex fires, a nervous impulse travels from the motor cortex down through the brainstem, through the spinal cord, down the efferent motor neurons in our limbs, and then it terminates synapses onto a muscle, and then the muscle moves. The motor cortex, which is the start of this nervous pathway, is a strip of cortex running from the very top of the brain down to the sides, and that strip, that motor strip, if you like, is just anterior to the central sulcus in the brain. The somatosensory cortex, on the other hand, is the end of the sensory pathway in the nervous system. And that's a pathway that begins with the sensory cells in our skin. So, for example, if I touch the wall, the sense cells in my skin send nervous impulse up the afferent pathway, up my arm, into my spinal cord, up through the brainstem, and that pathway then terminates in the somatosensory cortex, and that is a strip of brain which is just posterior to the central sulcus, and that's in the parietal lobe of the brain. The central sulcus separates the frontal lobe of the brain from the parietal lobe of the brain. Now, both the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex are contralaterally connected. In other words, the left-hand side controls the right-hand side of the body, and the right-hand side of the brain controls the left-hand side of the body. And that means that if you have a stroke or a brain injury in, say, the left-hand part of your brain, you're going to be paralysed, or you're going to have a numb sensation in the right-hand side of your body, and vice versa. How do we know all this? Well, this is due to the work of a Canadian brain surgeon called Penfield. And he realised that you could do a very interesting experiment on people's brains during brain surgery. Now, one of the curious things about the brain is that it contains no pain receptors. So, if you want to do brain surgery on someone, then all you need is a local anaesthetic on the scalp. What you do is you have a local anaesthetic on the scalp, and then you can remove a part of the scalp and the skull and expose the brain and do your brain surgery. But that's actually not going to cause any pain inside the skull because the brain's got no pain receptors. So during brain surgery, for the main part, people are conscious and awake. And what Penfield did is a little bit of experimentation during brain surgery. He got the people to kind of agree to this first. Informed consent. And what he did is he used an electrode and just gave a little bit of electrical stimulation to different parts of the brain to see what the effect would be. Now, what he noticed is that if he stimulated the part of the brain which is now known as the motor cortex, that is the bit anterior to the central sulcus, then what would happen is that the patient would move. There would be movements in their muscles, often quite localised, small movements, the hand, feet, face, you name it. And they were contralateral, so stimulate the right-hand side and the left-hand side of the body would move, and vice versa. And also, he noticed that if you stimulated the bottom part of the motor cortex, often the facial muscles would move, and if you stimulated the top of the motor cortex, then often parts of the body lower down would move. Equally, if you stimulate the part of the brain which is now known as the somatosensory cortex, that is to say just posterior to the central sulcus, then patients would report a physical sensation. It would be as if they were being touched or something was touching them. And once again, there is a localization of function within the somatosensory cortex itself. That when Penfield stimulated the cortex lower down in the brain, then people would report a sensation in their face or in their mouth. And when he stimulated the cortex further towards the top of the somatosensory cortex, or towards the dorsal part of it, then they would report a sensation lower down in the body. And right at the very bottom of the somatosensory cortex, they'd report an internal sensation, like an intra-abdominal, so they could feel their guts moving. And this is how we know that these functions of the brain are localized into the motor and the somatosensory cortices. It's all down to the work of Wilder Penfield. The primary visual pathway is how the brain sees, and the primary visual pathway runs from the retina to the occipital lobe at the very back of the brain, and the occipital lobe contains the primary visual cortex, also called V1. And the reason we know that is because if you have an injury to the very, very rear of your brain, then quite often you'll go blind. Okay, the primary visual pathway is unusual in the brain because it contains both contralateral and ipsilateral connections. Remember that in most of the brain, connections are contralateral, they cross over. Well, in the primary visual pathway, some connections are contralateral and some are same-sided ipsilateral connections. In the retina, rods and cones collect light from the outside world passing through the lens of the eye, and the rods and cones connect to ganglion cells in the retina. Ganglion cells have axons which come together and form the optic nerve. The optic nerve is a bundle of the axons of ganglion cells, and there's a left optic nerve and a right optic nerve running from each eye, and they travel through the head and they join together right in the middle of the head at a place called the optic chiasm, or also known as the optic chiasma. And in the optic chiasma, some of the nervous pathways stay on the same side and some of them cross over. So there are both contralateral and ipsilateral connections, and that crossing over takes place in the optic chiasm. The primary visual pathway then projects to the LGN, the lateral geniculate nucleus, and then to the primary visual cortex at the very rear of the brain in the occipital lobe, where the primary visual pathway terminates. So what's going on in the optic chiasm, and why are there contralateral and ipsilateral connections there? Well, it's really rather simple. The fact is that your left visual field in both eyes connects to the right hand side of the brain, and the right visual field in both eyes connects to the left hand side of the brain. So if I grab a pen and I hold that in my right visual field, the light from that pen is entering both of my eyes, but the image of the pen ends up only in my left hemisphere, and obviously correspondingly vice versa. So in my left visual field, the light from the pen is entering both eyes and in both retinas, but it's in the left visual field of both eyes, and that image connects to my right hemisphere. And so the primary visual pathway contains both contralateral and ipsilateral connections, but in a very predictable way. The primary auditory pathway is really easy to understand. Basically, it just runs from the ears to the auditory centres in the brain. Inside the inner ear, there's a thing called the cochlea, and that translates vibrations in the air into nervous impulses. Those nervous impulses run down the auditory nerve to the brain stem, and from there the auditory pathway connects to the temporal lobe, where are located the two auditory areas in the brain. The primary auditory pathway is mainly comprised of contralateral connection, but there are some same-sided ipsilateral connections as well. Okay, in a moment I'm going to be talking about the language areas of the brain. That's Broca's area and Wernicke's area. But first, it's time for this week's random psychology fact.
This week's random psychology fact is that research has shown it only takes 4 seconds of awkwardness in a conversation to significantly increase your anxiety levels.
That was this week's random psychology fact. Okay, speech in the brain. Well, the first thing to realise is that speech is located in the left hemisphere. And that goes for right and left-handed people, that the left hemisphere is really specialised for speech. And we know this because of the work of two psychologists who were working in the 19th century, Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke. So, Broca first. Broca had a patient called Tan, and Tan, basically his speech just got worse and worse and worse over 21 years until he could only actually say one single word, Tan, which is why he was nicknamed Tan. It wasn't his real name. And he had what is now called Broca's aphasia. Aphasia is the inability to speak. When Tan died, Broca looked at his brain in a post-mortem, and it turned out that Tan had a very severe brain injury in the frontal lobe of the left hemisphere, just anterior to the motor cortex. And here is a picture of Tan's brain, and you can see that brain injury in the part of the brain that is now called Broca's area. And over the years, Broca had lots and lots of different patients who had injuries in this brain area, and they all had Broca's aphasia, an inability to speak properly. People with Broca's aphasia typically have halting and effortful speech, filled with lots of silences. They can quite often say content words, like nouns, basically, but they can't string them together into complete sentences. So if I had Broca's aphasia and I was describing to you what happened to me this morning, I might say breakfast, bus, rain, late, or something like that. And you might be able to understand what happened to me, but the problem is I can't speak fluently. They have difficulty often finding even the content words, some of them. Their writing is also affected. When they try to handwrite, they show the same deficit with written language as they do with spoken language. People whose first language is sign language, deaf people, show exactly the same symptoms with signing as they do with speech if they have an injury in Broca's area. And if you want to know what Broca's aphasia actually looks like and sounds like in real life, then the internet is full of people who have made videos of themselves people who are genuinely suffering from Broca's aphasia and are happy to share their symptoms. In particular, I'd recommend the videos of a very brave woman called Sarah Scott, who had a stroke in Broca's area while she was at school, and she's done a video over a series of years which show her slow improvement. Wernicke, Carl Wernicke. Well, he examined a different part of the brain, this time in the temporal lobe, just posterior to the auditory cortex. And if you have an injury in what is now called Wernicke's area, then typically you'll have two primary symptoms. Number one, you can't understand speech. You just don't understand what people are saying. And secondly, you can produce fluent speech, but it's kind of word salad. It's like sentences which are kind of sound grammatically correct, but actually don't contain any proper words. And once again, if you want to know what that looks and sounds like, then really do go and have a look on the internet, because there's lots of examples there that you can look at. Fascinatingly, people with Wernicke's aphasia also have anosognosia, which means that they don't know that there's anything wrong with them. They think that they can understand and speak perfectly well, where evidently they can't. But their primary deficit that we're interested in is that they're unable to understand spoken speech. Okay, so how does this work in the whole brain? Like, at the moment, we've just been looking at people with brain injuries, so how does this actually work when you look at a normal brain that hasn't been injured at all? Right, well, incoming information, sound, speech, comes in through both ears and travels through the auditory pathway to the two auditory cortices. Now, in the left hemisphere, the auditory cortex is right next door to Wernicke's area. So Wernicke's area recognises that the sound that we're hearing is speech, as opposed to music or, you know, the sound of whatever's going on outside. If we want to speak, then Broca's area commands our motor area to articulate the words, and uses the primary motor pathway, which of course starts in the motor area, to use our lips and our tongue and our articulatory apparatus to create the speech. And that is how the brain works. Well, it's what we need to know for A-level.